Sometimes the smallest moments unravel the biggest truths. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal thought he'd seen it all, until he watched an 8-year-old girl get silenced in broad daylight for simply crossing a street. But when the police erased the only footage that could prove the truth, Shaq didn't walk away, he stood taller. Now buried lies, a cracked badge, and a system built to protect itself are about to collide. One rookie cop holds the secret, one little girl holds the truth. And Big Shaq, he's about to take the stand and change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The heat that day was thick, clinging to the skin like guilt. Downtown Atlanta had its usual hum delivery trucks grumbling past, mothers tugging strollers, the scent of fried catfish drifting from someone's porch window. On Broad Avenue, traffic idled at the red light, the sun pressing down on windshields as if daring the world to notice what was about to happen. Across the intersection, Zaria Monroe, small and proud in her unicorn backpack, waited at the corner with a half-melted popsicle in one hand and a library book in the other. Her afro puffed out around her head like a halo, her eyes wide with the kind of innocence the world doesn't always protect. She was only 8, but she'd already learned to look both ways more than once, because the danger in her world didn't always come from moving cars. She stepped into the crosswalk just as the light changed. It should have been ordinary. It should have been forgettable. But the moment her shoe touched the faded white stripe, the cruiser at the far end screeched forward. Even though it had no business moving, the driver's face twisted in irritation. Then something else, something darker. Officer Griggs was known in the neighborhood, though not in the way that earned respect. Tall, square-jawed, a tight buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that turned every gaze back in on itself. He slammed the brakes beside the girl, rolled the window down, and leaned across the passenger seat with a barking voice that ruptured the air. "Hey, didn't your mama teach you not to jaywalk? You trying to get yourself killed?" Zaria froze, mid-stride. The popsicle dropped from her fingers and bled into the asphalt like a slow wound. The light above her blinked green, but no one moved. The city held its breath. A group of teens across the street lowered their phones, unsure if recording would help or just invite trouble. A man at the food cart cursed under his breath but said nothing. A woman tugged her toddler closer. Zaria's lip trembled, but she didn't cry. She looked confused, more confused than scared, and that made it worse. It wasn't just the volume of the voice. It was the weight of it, the implication, the public shaming of a black child for daring to walk. A block away, just outside the Boys and Girls Club, a black Escalade sat parked under the shade of a leaning maple. Behind the tinted windshield, Shaquille O'Neal leaned forward, elbow on the steering wheel, watching. His size made most people stare, but his stillness could turn invisible when he wanted it to. And right now, he wanted it. Because what he was witnessing wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. It was just the same song on repeat, this time with a new verse. Shaq had been in town only 2 days for a youth mentoring campaign titled Voices Before Violence. He'd spoken to high schoolers, church leaders, even the mayor. But nothing he'd said in those sessions mattered right now. Not if this little girl went home tonight thinking the world had already decided who she was. Officer Griggs stepped out of his cruiser and barked again, asking Zaria her name like she'd stolen something instead of walking across a public street. His hand hovered near his belt, not on his gun, but close enough for the gesture to echo. The words that followed weren't threats exactly, but they didn't have to be. Shaq's fingers tightened around the wheel. His jaw flexed, the memory of his own childhood slamming into the present like a car crash. His mother Lucille had taught him patience, control, and to pick his battles. But this wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. He didn't approach right away. He didn't want to escalate. He knew how this system worked. Knew how often concerned bystanders became agitated suspects in the police report. So instead, he reached slowly into his glove box and pulled out his phone. Quietly, he started recording. Not just the officer, but the way the people around refused to move. He zoomed in on the girl's face, her stillness, the tiny tremble in her knee. Then back to Griggs, whose voice was now lowered, but whose presence still cast a threat over the moment like a thundercloud that hadn't yet broken. When the officer finally let her go with a condescending, "Watch yourself next time," Zaria barely moved. She looked left and right again, then sprinted the last few feet to the curb. Her mother, Kenya, came flying out of the laundromat next door, having seen everything from the reflection in the glass. She scooped Zaria into her arms, whispering something over and over that only her daughter could hear. Shaq put his phone down. He stepped out of the car, slowly, not toward the officer, but toward the sidewalk, careful not to draw attention. He nodded at Kenya. He didn't have to say anything. His presence, all 7'1" of it, said enough. Kenya recognized him instantly, but her eyes were too busy scanning her daughter's face to react. Zariah looked at him, blinked once, and offered the faintest nod. That night, the video made its way online. No yelling, no confrontation, just a quiet clip of a towering man capturing a small injustice in real time. It didn't go viral yet, but something was already happening. The truth was stretching its arms, preparing to rise. Back in his hotel room, Shaq sat in silence for a long time. The city lights blinked through the curtain, shadows flickering across the walls like echoes. He replayed the footage over and over, not for the officer's face, but for Zariah's. For the moment her posture changed, the second she stopped being a kid and became a target. He thought about his own childhood again. Jacksonville, New Jersey, the stairs in grocery stores, the security guard who followed him every time he walked into a corner shop with his friends. The slow drip of shame that came not from being caught doing something wrong but from never being seen doing anything right. This wasn't just about jaywalking. It never was. It was about how systems operated in the shadows, how small incidents became trauma, how a child could lose her voice without anyone laying a hand on her. And Shaq, the man they called Big Aristotle, Superman, and the Diesel, had spent a lifetime learning when to speak, when to wait, and when to act. This time, he would act. The next morning, he didn't start with a press conference. He started with breakfast. He showed up at Kenya Monroe's front porch with 2 bags of donuts, a stack of coloring books, and a quiet question. "Can I come in?" No cameras, no entourage, just a giant man in a gray hoodie with hands that could crush a watermelon, offering comfort like a pastor before Sunday service. He sat on the floor with Zariah while she showed him her favorite drawings. He asked her about her dreams, her favorite books, and what made her laugh. She told him about how she wanted to be a teacher, and how she hated math, and how she liked the rain because it made the world quieter. Shaq listened like her words were treasure. And in those moments, something shifted, not just in her but in him. Because the world had already tried to silence her once, but now she had someone listening, and he wasn't going anywhere. He saw what no one else wanted to admit. Shaq stood at the edge of the Monroe's living room, a quiet giant folding into the corners of a modest space worn by life. The couch was sunken from years of use. The kitchen tiles were cracked near the fridge, and an oscillating fan groaned on the floor, doing its best to hold off George's sticky summer heat. On the coffee table, Zariah's crayons were scattered across pages of half-finished drawings, dinosaurs, stars, and something that looked like a smiling sun, though the strokes had gone darker toward the edges. Kenya Monroe moved with weary grace, balancing politeness with pain. She offered sweet tea in a mismatched glass, and sat across from Shaq like she was still deciding whether to trust him or brace herself. Her eyes, sharp and deeply tired, never fully softened. They had the look of someone who'd already learned to prepare for disappointment, especially from people who claimed to help. Shaq didn't press. He let the silence breathe. Zariah was upstairs, napping after a lunch she barely touched. The air still carried a tremble from that morning's encounter. Kenya finally broke it with a low, tired sigh. "This wasn't the first time," she said, more to the wall than to him. "Not even the 5th. Shaq leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, listening with the kind of stillness that demanded nothing but gave everything. Kenya glanced at him, measuring his presence not by fame but by intention. "She was 7 the first time," Kenya continued. "Officer stopped her on the school steps, said she looked out of place. She had her school ID in her damn hand. They said it was a mix-up, but she cried herself to sleep for 3 days. Her fingers tightened around the glass. I tried filing a complaint, got a form letter in return." Shaq nodded slowly, not with surprise but recognition. He'd heard these stories in barbershops, locker rooms, boardrooms, dressed in polite euphemisms. They always sounded the same: a misunderstanding, an oversight, a policy error. But every excuse was a crack in the foundation of trust, and eventually, the whole structure gave out. "People think racism has to shout," Kenya said, "but it whispers too. Slips into paperwork, into who gets suspended, into who gets a second chance." Her voice didn't shake, it sharpened. "They flagged her for disruptive behavior last year, because she didn't want to play a police officer in a school skit. Said it showed defiance. She just didn't want to wear the uniform. Said it made her stomach hurt." Shaq looked down at the floor, jaw tight. The truth sat heavy between them. Not explosive, not loud, but present like weight on the chest. And this time, there was no referee to blow the whistle, no fourth-quarter buzzer to save the day. Just a mother, a child, and a system slowly eroding their hope. Kenya stood, paced once, then sat back down. Her gaze met his, steady now. "So what do you want to do?" she asked. "Because attention ain't the same as action. I've had news vans on my lawn before. And after they leave, we're still here, still tired, still scared. Shaq's answer came low and even. I want to make it so she doesn't have to be scared to walk down her own street. And I want to make sure no other little girl gets stared down like she's a threat before she even learns long division. It wasn't a promise. It was a vow. That night, Shaq didn't go back to his hotel. He called Lucille, his mother, told her everything. She didn't gasp. She didn't panic. She just said, "Then you know what you need to do, baby. Stand up, even if your knees shake." He slept on the Monroe's couch, too large for the cushions, his feet hanging over the armrest. Around 2 a.m., he woke to the sound of Kenya crying quietly in the kitchen. He didn't interrupt. Grief and fear have their own time zones. All he could do was make sure she didn't feel alone in it. By morning, the game plan was already unfolding. He reached out to a legal contact, Amara Dorsey, a civil rights attorney known for her relentless fire in the courtroom. He explained the situation with careful precision, knowing full well what cases like this cost, not just financially, but spiritually. Amara agreed to meet with the family that afternoon. Then came the calls to local activists, school board members, and community organizers. Quiet at first, strategic. Shaq knew better than to blow it all open without laying groundwork. He'd seen how fast the media could twist a story, especially one involving race, law enforcement, and a child. What struck him most over the next few hours was how many people had stories like Zariah's, but with no cameras, no witnesses, and no Shaq watching from a block away. A local teacher shared that 5 students of color had been suspended in the past year for non-compliance during police-led school events. A bus driver whispered that he'd seen Officer Griggs harass teens near the park but didn't speak up out of fear for his job. A janitor at the elementary school admitted that he'd been asked to keep an eye on certain kids during lunch hour, kids who just happened to all be black. The pattern wasn't just visible. It was screaming, but nobody wanted to hear it. That evening, Amara arrived at the Monroe home. Her presence was quiet thunder, calm but undeniable. She listened intently to Kenya's account, Zariah's timeline, and Shaq's recording. She nodded slowly, tapping her pen against a yellow legal pad. "They're not going to roll over on this," she warned. "They'll close ranks, claim protocol, say the footage isn't conclusive. You ready for that?" Shaq looked at Kenya. Kenya looked at Zariah, who sat curled at the foot of the stairs listening without pretending otherwise. Then Kenya answered, "We're already living the consequences. Might as well fight for something while we're in it." Amara gave a sharp nod. "Then we go public. Not just the footage, the pattern, the history, the silence." Shaq exhaled, knowing the battle lines were drawn. The next morning, he sat alone on a bench outside Zariah's school as the sun rose. Birds chirped. Parents dropped kids off like nothing had happened. The world didn't stop for injustice. It just absorbed it, like smog. He watched as Zariah stepped out of the car with her mother, backpack swinging behind her like a shield. She didn't look back. That was when Shaq realized something vital. This fight wasn't about being loud. It was about being present, being undeniable, being the person who didn't look away when the world told you to. Because sometimes being a witness is the most powerful stand you can take. And Shaq had seen enough. The past doesn't just haunt, it fuels the fight. The rhythm of Atlanta's late afternoon faded into a muffled hush as Shaq stood alone in the community gym's empty court. The echoes of a bouncing basketball still faint in his ears, though no one had touched the rim in hours. Sunlight leaked through the high windows in golden slants, carving long shadows across the polished wood. The place smelled of sweat, memories, and old victories, none of them recent. He leaned against the padded wall beneath the hoop, a hand resting on his chest, as if steadying something deep and unruly. This wasn't the court he grew up on, but it felt close, close enough to pull ghosts from where they'd been stored away. There were things Shaq didn't often talk about, even to those closest to him, not because he forgot, but because revisiting them was like peeling old wounds that had never healed right. He hadn't become Big Shaq without scars. He thought back to Newark, where his mother, Lucille, raised him with discipline sharper than steel, and love deeper than shame. She worked multiple jobs, secretary, cleaner, even a lunch lady one summer. Whatever it took to make sure her son had shoes that fit and a safe route home. She didn't just raise him to be big in stature. She raised him to be bigger than the world's perception of him. But that didn't mean the world hadn't tried to define him early. There was a time, he was maybe 10, maybe 11, when the basketball court near his school had been the only place he felt free. The cracked concrete, chain-link fences, and double rims were his church. But even there, freedom was rented. One afternoon, after draining 4 straight shots, a white coach from another district team walked over with a smirk. "You're a big one, huh?" Gotta be careful with kids like you. Don't want you hurting the little guys. He remembered the sting of the phrase kids like you. Not said in anger, said in assumption. That same year, a neighbor called the cops because Shaq and his friend were lingering outside a convenience store. They were counting quarters to buy orange sodas. 2 officers pulled up, questioned them, took their names. They left without an apology. But the message had been delivered. You don't get to just exist without permission. Lucille had stormed to the precinct the next morning, dragging Shaq with her. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. She made them write a formal note clearing his name, and made sure he watched them do it. You don't walk around with shadows they put on you, she had said. You write your own light. And so Shaq had grown, inch by inch, foot by foot, into a man who smiled often, spoke softly, and played like a giant, but who carried those old shadows like a second jersey beneath his name. Now in this gym, holding the echoes of Zaria's tears and Kenya's steel in his memory, those ghosts pressed closer. They didn't haunt, they instructed. They reminded him why this mattered. He had tried to stay quiet in recent years, to let younger voices lead, to focus on education, philanthropy, giving back in quiet ways. But this wasn't something to walk past. Not when he'd seen a little girl flinch at a voice that sounded like command, not protection. Not when her mother had more police reports in a drawer than birthday cards on the mantel. Shaq picked up the ball from the floor and bounced it once, hard. The echo rattled the rafters, but it wasn't enough. He pulled out his phone, opened a new message, and began contacting Raylan Pritchett, an old friend from college, who now worked as a media producer for a national news outlet. Raylan was loud, brave, and impossible to ignore. If anyone could shape the narrative truthfully and protect the family from being twisted into some political pawn, it was him. The message was short. Need your eyes on something. Not for me. For a girl who reminds me too much of everything we said we'd never let happen again. Then came another call to Bishop Trenholm, a local civil rights historian and pastor, whose influence extended beyond pulpits into courtrooms and city council halls. Shaq asked for his presence at the first community gathering, not as a speaker but as a quiet wait. Trenholm agreed immediately. The plan was growing, and Shaq wasn't moving in anger. He was moving in memory. That evening, Kenya and Zariah joined him back at the gym. Zariah hesitated at first, her small fingers clenched around her mother's. But Shaq met her at the door with a smile that said nothing would ever harm her here. He taught her how to pivot, not just on the court, but in her thoughts, how to breathe before reacting, how to lift her chin even when she felt like curling in. They played until the sunset dipped through the glass high above, and Zariah laughed for the first time in days. Not the careful laugh she gave to appease her mother's worry, but the reckless, bubbling kind that only a child can summon when they finally feel safe. Shaq caught Kenya watching from the bleachers, her arms folded across her chest, eyes glistening. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Later that night, sitting on the bleachers beside Kenya while Zariah drew quietly near the court's edge, Shaq shared a piece of his past. Not the part about the NBA or championships, but about the officer who once made him sit on a curb for 30 minutes while they called in his ID because they didn't believe he could afford the sneakers he was wearing. Kenya listened, silent. That's when I learned, Shaq said, voice steady, that no amount of money makes you immune. Not if you're built like me. Not if your skin comes first. Kenya nodded slowly. So what made you keep going? She asked. Shaq exhaled, looking out at the court where Zariah now mimicked his post-up moves. Because my mom told me the world would try to make me smaller than I am, and I figured if I let it, then it wins. Every time I walk into a room and take up space, that's my protest. She smiled, just slightly. It was the first time her expression had softened since the crosswalk. Shaq rose from the bench and picked up his phone again. The message to Raylan had already been read. A reply blinked across the screen. I'm in. You tell me when. And how loud. He texted back 2 words. Tomorrow morning. As he walked toward the court, he thought again about the past. The playgrounds with broken swings, the cracked sidewalks of Newark, the teachers who believed in him, and the cops who didn't. He thought about Lucille, fighting for him with her whole chest, teaching him that silence was a luxury black kids couldn't afford. Now he carried that legacy like armor. The ghosts of the playground hadn't disappeared. They were just watching, waiting to see what he'd do next. And Shaq, he wasn't running. He was planting his feet. Because this wasn't just about Zariah. It was about every kid who deserved to walk a sidewalk without having to prove they belonged on it. The truth was recorded, but the truth went missing. The morning after the city began to murmur, the Monroe household felt lighter. Briefly, Shaq had spent the previous evening organizing statements, outlining timelines with Amara Dorsey, and preparing Kenya for the official complaint she was set to file. A clear path was forming. Hold Officer Griggs accountable through process and truth. They had footage, they had witnesses, and most importantly, they had momentum. But in a system built on delay and deflection, momentum was often the first casualty. Kenya arrived at the precinct that morning, dressed not for war, but for dignity. A beige blazer, pressed slacks, and Zariah's drawing folded neatly into her purse, an image of a girl holding a sign that read, "I belong here." She waited nearly 45 minutes before being seen by someone from Internal Affairs. A tall man named Sergeant Welker, who spoke in clipped phrases and never quite looked her in the eye. She handed over the written complaint, citing the exact time and location of the incident, naming Officer Griggs directly. She requested access to the department's body cam footage under Georgia's open records law. Welker nodded as if he were trying to recall a grocery list, scribbled a few notes, and told her she'd receive a follow-up call soon. That call came exactly 3 hours later. "We reviewed Officer Griggs' body cam files for July 9th. Unfortunately, there was a data corruption issue during that time window. The footage is not retrievable." Kenya didn't respond at first. The words echoed in her mind, slower than the man had spoken them. She'd heard lies before, but this one wasn't even trying to sound real. It was efficient, sterile, and rehearsed. Shaq was with Zariah at the community center when the news came in. Kenya didn't cry when she told him. Her voice was even, but it trembled at the edges like the rim of glass holding too much water. "They lost the footage," she said. "They're calling it a malfunction." Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't cuss. He didn't throw a chair. He simply stood there, 6 feet of stillness, 7 feet of control, and whispered. They didn't lose it. They erased it. That evening, the war room came together inside the gym's back office. Amara sat at the center, phone in one hand, legal documents in the other. Shaq paced behind her, shoulders hunched like a mountain preparing for avalanche. Kenya sat by the door, still processing the speed at which truth could be denied with a single line of bureaucratic indifference. Amara clicked her pen and started outlining next moves. "There's precedent for requesting internal audits, but the department's got protections. We'll hit walls. We'll get delays. This is the part where they expect us to go away." Shaq paused, turned slowly toward her. "We're not going away." "No," Amara agreed, locking eyes with him. "We're going loud." Raylan Pritchett arrived 20 minutes later, camera gear slung over his shoulder and energy buzzing like static. "I've seen cover-ups, but this one? It's so clean it's dirty. Tell the story right, and they won't have time to spin it." They filmed the interview that night. Kenya sat alone in a folding chair under a single hanging light bulb. There were no cue cards, no scripts, just her voice, just her story. He yelled at her, like she was a criminal, like she wasn't 8 years old, like she didn't matter. "And now they're saying the proof doesn't exist. But I saw it happen, and so did my daughter, and so did the man who stood across the street, and didn't look away." Shaq didn't appear in that first video. Not yet. This wasn't about him. It was about Zariah. It was about every little black girl who'd been scolded, overlooked, or quietly erased. Raylan cut the footage overnight, spliced it with the timeline and a few still frames from Shaq's own video. Grainy, yes, but damning. It showed Griggs outside his car. It showed Zariah standing motionless mid-crosswalk. It showed enough. The video was posted at 6:07 a.m. with the caption, "If the footage is gone, then here's the truth." By noon, it had 230,000 views. By 4 p.m., the department issued a generic statement. "We take all complaints seriously. We are currently investigating the incident." Shaq didn't need to read between the lines. That statement said, "We're stalling." That statement said, "Let the news cycle move on." But this time, it wouldn't. Because the city was beginning to hum. Parents were talking outside schools. Teachers whispered in break rooms. Neighborhood forums filled with arguments, questions, and finally anger. At a town hall scheduled the following evening, the crowd spilled onto the sidewalk outside. Kenya sat with Amara on one side, Shaq on the other. The school superintendent was present, stone-faced and silent. A representative from the police department showed up and said all the right hollow things. Then Shaq stood. He didn't prepare remarks. He didn't need them. His voice filled the room like thunder without rage. "She didn't do anything wrong. That little girl walked across a street she's walked 100 times. The problem isn't her feet. It's how you see her when she moves." People leaned forward, eyes fixed, mouth still. "And now you're saying the camera that's designed to keep us safe just happened to stop working at the exact moment she was made to feel like a threat." He let the silence stretch, not for drama, for weight. You want us to trust a system that keeps erasing our children? Then stop pretending accidents only happen when we ask for answers. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Outside the building, protest signs began to appear. A local church hung a banner that read, "We stand with Zariah." Teenagers passed out QR codes linking to the video. A mural began to appear downtown, painted in time-lapse by an anonymous artist, Zariah's profile, wide-eyed and unbroken, rising from a sea of erased footage icons. Meanwhile, inside City Hall, panic stirred. The mayor's office reached out for a neutral discussion. The department requested a meeting off the record. Amara declined both. Shaq's next move was strategic. He contacted a nonprofit dedicated to exposing digital tampering in law enforcement data. They reviewed internal audit trails and issued a preliminary finding: possible deliberate deletion based on activity logs. That was enough to ignite national media. By the end of the week, the Atlanta Tribune ran a cover story titled, "The Footage That Vanished, A City Demands Answers." But with every step forward, resistance tightened. Anonymous calls to Kenya's home. Flyers on car windshields accusing her of lying. A segment on a local conservative radio station, painting Shaq as another celebrity chasing attention. They expected him to back down. He didn't. He posted a simple statement on his social feed. "If my name makes you pay attention, fine. But keep your eyes on the child who was nearly erased. Keep your ears on the silence that followed, and ask yourself why the truth is always the first thing to disappear." He signed it not as Shaq, not as Superman, but as Shaquille O'Neal, son of Lucille, and defender of voices that don't get heard. That night, Kenya watched the news in her living room, the television glow painting shadows across Zariah's drawings. Her daughter sat beside her, small but alert.
"Are they gonna fix it, Mama?" she asked quietly.
Kenya looked at the screen. The city. The man who didn't walk away. The movement that had started from a single scream at a crosswalk. She put her arm around her daughter and said, "They won't erase us this time. Social media doesn't wait for permission to explode." When the video of Shaq kneeling beside Zariah outside the gym surfaced online, it wasn't designed to go viral. It was quiet, barely 2 minutes long. No music, no dramatic edits, just a soft-spoken man, impossibly large beside the little girl, telling her she mattered, telling her she was not what they called her, not what they feared, and not what they wanted her to believe. It was raw, unfiltered, the kind of moment that hits harder because it doesn't try to. By the next morning, it had reached 4.7 million views. The caption under the post read, "They tried to erase her, so we built a wall of truth around her." The reaction was immediate, relentless, and impossibly loud. It was as if a fuse had been burning under the surface of the country, and this clip, this quiet image of tenderness in the face of fear, ignited it. Hashtags flooded timelines. "Justice for Zariah, to protect our kids, Shaq stands tall." News anchors played the clip on loop, with split-screen panels debating its implications. Celebrities chimed in, civil rights advocates, teachers, parents, but then came the other side. The backlash slithered in, organized and venomous. Accounts draped in blue flags and eagle avatars began to accuse the family of exaggeration, of playing the race card, of staging the incident. Comment sections exploded with deflection. What about the officer's safety? Why was she walking alone? Shaq should stick to basketball. One group, calling themselves the Honor Watch, released a statement decrying the unjust demonization of a good officer, accusing Shaq of weaponizing fame to incite anti-police sentiment. Within 24 hours, anonymous flyers were taped to the gates of Zariah's school, claiming Kenya Monroe was a race-baiting opportunist exploiting her child. The school board, rattled by the attention, called an emergency meeting to discuss whether Zariah's continued presence might be disruptive to the learning environment. Kenya sat in her car outside the school that evening, the weight of what was happening crashing into her chest like a storm surge. The very people who'd failed her daughter were now debating whether her presence was too much. Zariah sat in the back seat, watching a cartoon on mute, her expression blank. The cost of visibility had arrived. At the gym, Shaq listened quietly as Kenya read the school board's email aloud, her voice laced with exhaustion and disbelief. Amara paced nearby, her jaw clenched. "They're using her as the scapegoat," Amara said. "They're saying, yes, something happened, but now she's the problem. This is textbook systemic pushback." Shaq stood, hands on hips, and stared out the high window. The storm outside wasn't physical. It was reputational, and it was moving fast. Raylan entered the room, holding his phone out like it was ticking. CNN wants a live sit-down. So does MSNBC. There's also a conservative podcaster offering Shaq a debate. Wants to discuss solutions instead of victimhood. Shaq didn't flinch. I'm not debating a child's humanity. That's not up for discussion. The group fell into a moment of silence, broken only when Zaria appeared at the doorway, holding a drawing. She walked over and handed it to Shaq. It showed a small girl standing under a giant open umbrella, shielding her from rain, labeled hate, lies, fear. The umbrella was labeled truth. Shaq looked at it for a long moment. We're not stepping back, he said. We step louder. That decision marked a turning point. The Monroe family, with Amara and Shaq at their side, launched a series of videos under the campaign Still Here. Each clip was a simple 60-second message spoken directly to the camera. Not defensive, not angry, just honest. Kenya's video was the most powerful. My daughter didn't ask to be a symbol. She didn't ask to be political. She asked to cross the street. And instead of protecting her, you questioned her. You blamed her. But she's still here. And she's not alone. It reached over 15 million views in 48 hours. Then the threats began. First, Kenya received an anonymous voicemail, filled with slurs and the promise of consequences if you keep pushing this. Then someone tagged Zaria's school with graffiti. Lies ruin lives. But still, no one from the city offered protection. No extra patrols. No public reassurance. Instead, the superintendent released a statement affirming the school's neutrality and asking families to avoid inflammatory rhetoric. Shaq had seen enough. He went live from his personal account, standing outside the school gates. The camera was steady. His tone was calm, but carved from stone. You say this child is disruptive. You say her story is political. But the only thing political here is your silence. If you're more afraid of noise than injustice, maybe you're not fit to lead our schools or our city. Within an hour, the clip had been reposted by every major outlet. And that's when the pressure began to hit from both sides. Corporate sponsors started calling Shaq's team, politely inquiring if he planned to remain involved in the matter. One brand suggested that his stance might alienate core demographics. He hung up mid-sentence. The mayor's office requested a private lunch meeting. Shaq declined. Reporters began camping outside Kenya's apartment complex. Raylan rigged a privacy tent and rerouted her mail. But the real damage was invisible. Zaria stopped drawing. She slept with the lights on. At night she asked her mom what ruin meant. And yet, amid the noise, something unexpected emerged. A coalition of teachers from across the state released a public letter titled, "Let Her Learn." It demanded that Zaria be protected and her school remain a safe space. Hundreds of parents began leaving handwritten notes outside her door. Children mailed her their own drawings, stories of their first school suspensions, their own moments of fear. One note read, "You're not the only one, but you're the first who made them listen." Shaq carried that note in his pocket for the next week. Despite the chaos, they continued. Amara filed a civil case. Raylan released an expose on the history of missing body cam footage in Georgia. Shaq contacted lawmakers he once shook hands with at charity events and asked where they stood now. The court of public noise wasn't dying down. It was evolving. It had gone beyond Zaria, beyond Griggs. It was about who got to be believed in America, about who got to walk without permission. In a rare moment of quiet, Shaq sat alone in the gym's locker room, Zariah's umbrella drawing in one hand, his mother Lucille's voice echoing in his mind. Don't raise your voice, raise your presence. He understood now more than ever. Being a giant didn't just mean standing tall. It meant making sure your shadow sheltered someone smaller, that your name didn't just echo, but protected. Because the noise would pass. But the message had to remain. What happens when silence is policy? The letter arrived folded, stamped, and hollow. Official school district header, impersonal language masked as concern, and a single sentence that stripped away the last illusion of neutrality. Effective immediately, Zaria Monroe is placed on administrative leave for her safety and the overall wellness of the school environment. It wasn't a suspension by name, but it was one in spirit. A 9-year-old girl, silenced again under the mask of protection, exiled from her own education, while the man who yelled at her in the street remained on payroll. Kenya held the paper in both hands, staring at the ink as though it might reshape itself into something more human. It didn't. Zaria sat on the couch behind her, legs swinging, backpack still packed as if someone might change their mind.
They said I'm a distraction, she whispered, almost to herself.
Shaq was already standing at the window, fists clenched just enough to whiten his knuckles, not enough to draw notice. He didn't need to ask Kenya if they'd fight it. The answer was already walking down the hallway in 2 big sneakers and a too heavy silence. The school board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night at the East End Civic Hall. a low brick building with flickering lights and a parking lot that hadn't been repainted since before Zariah was born. The agenda listed the issue as Community Disruption Response and Student Placement Review. Even the title refused to say her name. But Shaq did. Kenya did. So did Amara. So did the line of parents and teachers that formed early, winding around the block like a silent protest. Inside, the room filled quickly. Rows of folding chairs, an outdated microphone setup, water pitchers that sat untouched. At the front sat the board members, Superintendent Harold Ellison, thin-lipped and practiced, Chairwoman Margot Delaney, whose resume was longer than her empathy, and three others, whose faces shifted between discomfort and indifference. Kenya walked in holding Zariah's hand. Shaq followed behind them like a mountain come to court. He wore a charcoal gray suit and no tie. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just looked forward. The session opened with the usual ceremonial pleasantries. Roll call, flag salute, a reminder to the public to remain civil. Then came the agenda item. Chairwoman Delaney cleared her throat and began. In light of recent media attention and the potential disruption to the learning environment, we have, in consultation with district leadership and law enforcement, enacted a temporary reassignment for one student. This decision is not punitive. It is protective. A rustle went through the crowd, one of those breaths shared by 100 people who all know a lie when they hear one. Amara rose first to the podium. Her voice, sharp and focused, pierced through the sanitized fog of the board's language. Zaria Monroe is not a safety threat. She is a child who was publicly humiliated, whose trauma has been magnified by your refusal to stand up for her. She didn't bring disruption. She exposed it, and instead of protecting her, you chose to make her invisible. Delaney interrupted. We're not here to litigate. Amara didn't blink. Then what are we here to do? Just keep rearranging the furniture while the house burns down? There was a pause. Not long, but enough to show where fear lived on that board. Next came a teacher, Mr. Darnell Quaid, 5th grade science, balding, glasses too low on his nose. He had never spoken publicly before, but that night he said everything they needed to hear. I've taught Zariah. I've seen how she leads group projects, how she comforts classmates. I've also seen which students are watched closer, which ones get called out for tone, and which ones don't. We're not just failing her, we're training her to expect it. The crowd murmured in support. A few heads dropped, others nodded slowly. Then Shaq stood. He hadn't intended to speak that night, not publicly, but silence had become too expensive. He walked to the microphone, adjusted it slowly to his height, and looked across the panel into eyes that blinked at his size before blinking at his message. My name is Shaquille O'Neal. Some of you know me from TV, from basketball, from commercials, but that's not why I'm here. He turned slightly, motioning toward Kenya and Zariah in the front row. I'm here because I watched a little girl get treated like a problem for crossing a street, and now I'm watching her get punished again. Not because she did something wrong, but because you're scared of what her story reveals. His voice didn't rise. It deepened. I was a big kid growing up, bigger than everyone, and every time something went wrong, I was blamed first. Not because I did it, but because I was noticeable. Zaria's not even tall, but she's visible now, and you don't like that. A few members of the board shifted uncomfortably. Delaney leaned forward, lips tight. Shaq continued. You say this is for her safety, but what you really mean is it's for your comfort, because if she walks into that school, she's a reminder that you didn't do your job. He stepped back from the mic, but not from the message. I don't need applause. I don't need headlines. I've had more cameras on me than all of you combined. What I need is for this child to feel safe again, in her school, in her skin, and in the eyes of the people paid to protect her. He walked back to his seat in silence, but the room exhaled like it had been holding its breath for years. Then, a voice called out from the back, a parent, then another, and another. Let her back in. Do the right thing. Her name is Zariah. It wasn't a riot, it wasn't chaos, it was pressure. Pure, unapologetic pressure from the very community they served. Superintendent Ellison tapped his pen, cleared his throat, then said the only thing he could in that moment.
We will revisit the placement decision in a closed session.
It was a delay tactic. Everyone knew it. But the room didn't empty in defeat. It buzzed with movement, connection, resolve. Because now the mask had slipped. The polite neutrality of the board had been cracked, and behind it was something far less noble, fear of change. That night, Shaq sat on the gym bleachers with Zariah and handed her a milkshake, chocolate swirl. School's still figuring it out, he said, but you already know who you are. That's the part they can't touch. Zariah smiled, small and sleepy. You think they'll let me back? Shaq looked at her and replied with a quiet certainty. They can't stop you from showing up, and when you do, you'll be walking through that door with an army behind you. Because the showdown wasn't just about policy, it was about presence. And Zariah? She wasn't invisible anymore. Even steel bends under pressure. It started with a message, short, unsigned, and buried inside a folder of fan mail forwarded through a local nonprofit's inbox. No name, no badge number. Just a subject line that read, "I saw it." The body of the message was just as spare. "The footage you're looking for exists, or did. It doesn't match what's in the report. I want to help. I just don't know how." Shaq read it in the back of the gym, seated in his usual corner, the light overhead flickering faintly. He stared at the words for a long minute, then handed the screen silently to Amara, who read it twice before lowering it with a breath that carried too many battles in one exhale. "If it's real," she said, "it could crack this thing wide open." "If," Shaq repeated. "And if he's brave enough." Amora glanced at him. "You were a rookie once. You know the pressure." Shaq didn't answer right away. He thought of that thin line between survival and courage, silence and consequence, and how many times it was used to wrap people in fear. The next night, another message came through. This time, a time and place. No signature still. Just a single request. "Come alone." The spot was a little used parking structure tucked beneath a half-abandoned shopping plaza on the outskirts of West End. Shaq arrived in an unmarked SUV, hoodie drawn low, the evening breeze scraping through the cement pillars like a whispering wind. He stood beside his car, arms folded, watching. A few minutes later, a rusted silver Corolla pulled in and parked 3 spots away. The driver didn't move at first. Then the door opened, and out stepped a young man, mid-20s, lean build, buzzed hair, and nervous hands. His badge was nowhere in sight. His stance wasn't defensive, just uncertain. Shaq didn't speak. He waited. "I didn't know who else to contact," the man said finally, his voice barely above a breath. "But I saw what happened. I saw the original footage." Shaq took a slow step forward. "Then let's talk." The young man's name was Jonas Langston. Rookie cop, 4 months on the job, graduated top of his academy class, placed with pride in one of the department's more sensitive zones, which was code for neighborhoods where racial tension had long been left to simmer. He hadn't expected the quiet rot that came with the job. He certainly hadn't expected to be sitting in a parking garage talking to Shaquille O'Neal about a cover-up. "I was on the watch detail the morning of Zariah's incident," Langston began, glancing over his shoulder. "We monitor the feeds from body cams and traffic cams for patterns, red flags, routine stuff. I wasn't even supposed to be watching Griggs, but he flagged a non-compliant juvenile and routed a clip for supervisory review." Shaq nodded once, inviting him to continue. "I pulled the raw file before it was scrubbed," Langston said. "Just instinct. The footage showed Zariah walking into the crosswalk. Calm, lawful, not disruptive. Griggs escalated. He raised his voice, got out of the vehicle, approached aggressively. It didn't match his report at all." Shaq felt the tension rise in his chest, not because it was new, but because confirmation always makes injustice heavier. "You're saying they erased it because it didn't back him up?" Langston nodded, looking away. 2 hours later, the file was gone from the queue. A new one replaced it. Glitched, incomplete. The timestamp had been altered. Someone high up did it. I'm not senior enough to know who. Shaq's voice dropped low, steady. "Why are you telling me this?" Langston's jaw tightened. "Because I didn't sign up to lie, and because that little girl didn't deserve to be thrown under the bus so we could protect a badge." There it was. The crack. Not in Langston, but in the shield. That unwritten code of silence, loyalty, and plausible deniability. This wasn't about just one cop anymore. It was about the culture that demanded officers protect the institution even when it betrayed its own values. Shaq stepped closer. "You're risking your job." "I know. Maybe your life." Langston's eyes flinched, but he held the gaze. "I know that too." Shaq offered him a path. Not just forward, but through. He connected him with Amara, who immediately began outlining whistleblower protections, gathering timelines, and preparing a sworn affidavit. Langston agreed, but only if his identity remained sealed until the legal process reached discovery. Still, it was movement, and it shifted everything. By the end of the week, Amara filed an amended civil complaint citing an internal department witness with direct knowledge of tampered digital evidence. The filing didn't name Langston, but it sent shockwaves through the city's legal circles. It signaled that the truth wasn't hearsay anymore. It was living, breathing, and getting braver. The department responded by circling the wagons. A memo was distributed warning officers about unauthorized disclosures. Rumors swirled about internal loyalty reviews, late-night calls to personnel files, and disciplinary transfers designed to intimidate. But the leak had already spread. Other officers began whispering. None came forward publicly yet, but the dam had been punctured. Raylan caught wind of the affidavit and prepared a special segment. This time, Shaq appeared on camera. "I don't blame every officer. I don't hate the badge. But when the system lets someone lie and then erases the proof, that's not law enforcement, that's obstruction." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Public response was divided, but not evenly. Supporters of Zaria swelled in number. Retired officers posted statements. Clergy held press conferences demanding accountability. A coalition of black and brown officers signed a joint letter calling for an independent review. But with every inch of ground gained, the threats returned. Kenya received an anonymous package. Inside was a printed photo of Zaria at the playground, circled in red ink. No note, just the image. Amara reported it immediately, but the message was clear: silence is safer. Still, they pushed on. 1 week later, Langston met Shaq again, this time in Amara's office. "I want to go public," he said. "Not just in court. I want to testify. On the record, I can't breathe with this in my chest." Shaq didn't try to dissuade him. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "If you're ready to walk through it, we'll walk beside you." Because this was what courage looked like now. Not banners and chants, but a trembling rookie in a badge trying to choose justice over loyalty. The blue shield didn't shatter that day, but it cracked. And through that fracture, truth began to rise. Truth makes enemies, big ones. The email from the Atlanta Police Department came just after dawn. A sterile subject line, colder than winter metal. Administrative status notification, Officer R. Griggs. One sentence buried in a paragraph of jargon confirmed what they had fought weeks for. Officer Griggs has been placed on non-active duty pending internal review. No admission, no apology, just a reshuffling of position. Not justice, but a pause. Kenya read it aloud at the kitchen table, her voice neutral, unreadable. Zaria sat beside her, buttering toast with robotic focus. Shaq leaned against the counter, arms crossed, jaw clenched. For a moment, no one spoke. It wasn't victory, it was movement. And movement in a city this tangled with contradiction always came with noise. By mid-morning, the noise hit full throttle. Half the city breathed in relief. The other half screamed betrayal. A protest formed within hours just outside the police precinct, but it wasn't the kind Shaq had led in recent months. These protesters wore blue shirts with "Defend Our Own" scrawled in bold black font. They waved thin blue-line flags, chanted slogans about respect for law and order, and held up signs that read, "Don't demonize the badge," and "Griggs deserves due process." The news stations loved it. Conflict was ratings gold. They cut from footage of Zaria holding her mother's hand outside court to close-ups of angry men in wraparound sunglasses chanting Shaq's name like a curse. The narratives clashed. Talk radio turned the story into sport. One conservative host asked, "Since when does a child's word outweigh a decorated officer's record?" The same host had never mentioned Zaria's name until now. At the Monroe home, the tension was creeping in like fog through cracked windows. The voicemail box filled daily. Some voices angry, others kind, but all of them pressure. People offering money, threats, hope, demands. The weight was beginning to bend the foundation. Zaria, once vibrant and talkative, began to shrink. She asked to stay home from school more often. Her drawings lost their color. She'd wake at night from dreams she couldn't explain, heart racing, tears on her cheeks. One night, Kenya found her curled in the hallway, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the front door. "What if he comes back?" she whispered. Kenya couldn't lie, couldn't promise something beyond her reach, so she did the only thing she could. She held her daughter until her shaking stopped. The next morning, Shaq showed up with a duffel bag full of art supplies and noise-canceling headphones. He built Zaria a quiet corner in the gym's office, her own little sanctuary filled with light, softness, and no cameras. He called it the zone. No one else entered without her say. But beyond those walls, the fire kept rising. As the civil suit moved forward, the city's district attorney, Miranda Lott, entered the scene. Young, composed, and sharply ambitious, she'd watched the story unfold from behind closed doors, wary of inserting herself too soon. But now, amid growing pressure and community tension, she called a press conference. "We are opening a preliminary investigation into the conduct surrounding Officer Griggs' body cam records, including the potential for criminal data tampering," she stated. "No one is above the law. not even those entrusted to enforce it. The announcement was a seismic shift. Shaq watched the broadcast from the back of a community center meeting, nodding slowly as the words landed. This wasn't resolution, but it was escalation. And escalation meant new stakes. He began appearing at every court date without fail, towering in silence on the steps as reporters peppered him with questions. He gave no grand speeches, no declarations, just presence. A presence too large to ignore, and too calm to attack. Meanwhile, the opposition sharpened its fangs. Online forums buzzed with conspiracy theories. Edited footage began circulating, designed to discredit Zariah's version of events, cut and respliced with blurred timelines. A retired officer anonymously released a memo calling Shaq's involvement reckless celebrity activism. Talk show panels turned Zariah's trauma into political theater. But it didn't stop there. Anonymous letters were sent to the DA's office, claiming Kenya Monroe had coached her daughter for attention. One letter accused Amara Dorsey of exploiting the case for clout, despite her long record of quiet work. And though most of it was baseless, it was effective at creating doubt. Even allies began to question the pacing. How long will this drag on? What if it wasn't that serious? Should we be focusing on bigger issues? Shaq heard it all. Every sideways glance, every whispered frustration, every person itching for the fire to die down so they could return to comfort. But he'd come too far to leave the fight unfinished. One night, as a candlelight vigil formed outside the courthouse, families gathered with signs, poems, and pictures of their own lost moments. Shaq stood at the center, Zariah's drawing of the umbrella tucked in his back pocket. He didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke to Zariah, who stood beside him, holding a small flickering flame. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "No," he said, kneeling beside her. "It's not. Then why do we keep going?" Shaq looked into her eyes, steady as a mountain. "Because every time we do, we make it harder for them to pretend they didn't see." He stayed at the vigil until the last candle burned low, until the street emptied, until he could hear only his own breath and the soft hum of the city trying to turn the page. But the page wouldn't turn. Because the fire under the bench wasn't burning out. It was just getting hotter. Justice delayed is a tactic, not a coincidence. It was a Wednesday when the message came through, wrapped in procedural language and delivered without ceremony. A sealed envelope slid across Amara Dorsey's desk, marked confidential, do not disclose prior to public notice. She opened it with a practiced steadiness, but the words hit like a hammer all the same. The grand jury has declined to pursue criminal charges in the matter of Officer R. Griggs. Determination: insufficient evidence to support an indictment at this time. 12 words. No room for context. No reference to the erased footage. No mention of Officer Langston's sworn testimony or the mounting digital forensic reports. Just silence dressed as formality. Amara sat back in her chair, exhaled through her nose and closed her eyes. She'd seen this before, cases that bent under pressure, not from lack of truth, but from the weight of inconvenience. A system conditioned to protect its own, even when the walls were bleeding. She picked up the phone and called Shaq. He answered on the second ring. "It's a no," she said flatly. There was a pause. Then came the soft thump of Shaq setting his phone down on a table, followed by another kind of silence, the kind that carries thunder before the storm breaks. Across town, at the Monroe household, Kenya stared at the TV screen as the news cycle confirmed what she already felt coming in her gut. No charges. The banner looped beneath the anchor's tired faces, framed by images of courthouse steps, Blue Lives Matter signs, and a grainy still of Zariah crossing the street. Zariah was quiet. She didn't cry. She just walked to her room, shut the door, and didn't come out for hours. Shaq arrived just before sunset, ducking beneath the porch roof and stepping inside without speaking. Kenya didn't greet him. She didn't need to. The air said it all. They sat at the table, just the two of them, as the light drained from the sky and the neighborhood fell into a hush. Finally, Shaq broke it. She saw the truth. We all did, and they still said no. Kenya's voice was sharper than it had been in days. "They didn't say no. They said not yet. That's what this is. Delay, dismiss, discourage. It's all they know." Shaq nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the wood. "I'm not done," he said. "I didn't come this far to let them fold the page and pretend it's over." Amara arrived not long after, paperwork in her hands and purpose in her stride. She dropped a thick folder on the table and opened it with a single flick. "We're going civil," she said. "I've filed a motion for a federal-level inquiry into the department's record on racial misconduct, evidence suppression, and failure to discipline repeated offenders. This isn't about one cop anymore. It's about the whole house." Kenya raised an eyebrow. Can we win that? Amara didn't blink. That's not the question. The question is, how hard are we willing to push? Shaq's voice was low but full. As hard as it takes. The next few days moved like storm clouds gathering. The city's mood was brittle. Protests sparked again. But this time they felt different. Not just outraged, but exhausted. People held signs not just for Zariah, but for every unspoken case before her. Teachers marched. Parents linked arms. Even students from the local high school walked out in a coordinated silent demonstration, holding nothing but blank poster boards to represent every erased story. The department refused to comment. The mayor's office issued a sterile message about respecting due process. But behind closed doors, pressure was mounting. The civil suit brought with it the promise of depositions, cross-examinations, discovery, the kind of process that didn't just expose one officer, but revealed how many had been protected. Raylan Pritchett released an investigative documentary titled The System or the Silence, tracking 5 years of body cam footage inconsistencies, unreported suspensions, and racial discrepancies in student discipline referrals. It went viral in under a week. But even amidst the growing noise, Shaq moved quieter than ever. No interviews, no public statements, no showboating. He spent his days with Zariah in the gym, sometimes rebounding for her, sometimes reading while she drew. He spoke only when she wanted to, listened more than he led. One day, she looked up and asked, "What if they never say sorry?" Shaq folded his book, looked her in the eye. "Then we make sure they can't forget." That same week, Amara received a call from a DOJ representative. "We've reviewed the civil filing. We're interested." That was all she needed. She filed a formal request for an independent federal monitor to investigate patterns of misconduct, evidence manipulation, and discriminatory policy enforcement in the Atlanta PD. It was a long shot, but so was everything else until Zariah crossed that street. At a community meeting that Friday night, Shaq stood beside Kenya as she addressed a packed room of neighbors, educators, clergy, and students. They thought silence would kill the story. They thought ignoring our voices would stop the momentum. But what they didn't count on, what they never count on, is that we know how to outlast their silence. Applause rolled through the room like thunder, not in volume, but in force. Then Shaq took the mic, his frame hulking under the flickering gym lights. "I spent years in arenas where noise meant everything. But out here, it's different. Out here, silence is their weapon. So we respond by staying loud, not angry, not reckless, loud with truth, loud with consistency, loud until the cracks in the wall turn into doors." The crowd rose to their feet, not because he shouted, but because he spoke with the weight of a man carrying more than his own name. Back at home that night, Zariah placed a drawing on the fridge, her standing in a courtroom, holding a gavel with the words "My turn" above her head. Shaq looked at it, smiled, and nodded. The grand jury may have stayed silent. But Zariah wouldn't. Neither would they. Some battles you fight just by standing tall. The courtroom was colder than it needed to be. Air conditioning turned up too high, as if chill might contain the heat outside. The gallery was packed tight with reporters, activists, city officials, and parents holding back a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Phones were off, pens ready, eyes locked forward. Everyone was waiting for the moment the man they all knew as Shaq would become, finally and officially, the witness. The civil case of Monroe v. City of Atlanta had already drawn national attention. It wasn't just about Zariah anymore. It had become a symbol, a thread pulled from a wider knot of institutional misconduct. The claim: systemic negligence, record suppression, racial targeting, and retaliation. The charge: the city allowed its law enforcement to function without accountability. The core of it all: the silencing of a child and the power structure that tried to bury her under policy. Now Shaquille O'Neal was about to speak under oath, not as a celebrity, not as an athlete, but as a black man who had watched a little girl lose her safety under the weight of a badge and a lie. He walked to the stand slowly, not for effect, but because the moment required intention. His 7'1" frame filled the witness box. The microphone was adjusted 3 times before it reached his mouth comfortably. He took the oath with his right hand in the air, eyes steady on the judge. Amara Dorsey approached first. No theatrics, just clarity. "Mr. O'Neal, can you tell the court where you were on the morning of July 9th? Shaq nodded once. Downtown Atlanta, just outside the Boys and Girls Club, off Broad Avenue. "Why were you there?" "I was scheduled to speak at a youth mentorship event. I parked early, sat in the car a while. That's when I saw Zariah Monroe." "And what did you witness?" He paused. The room leaned in. She was walking across the street, alone. She was careful, checked both ways. She stepped into the crosswalk, legally. A squad car approached fast. It didn't hit her, but it pulled up hard, too hard. The officer started yelling, loud enough for me to hear through the windshield. And your reaction? I started recording, not because I wanted trouble, because I've seen what happens when you don't have proof. And because I knew, if I got out too fast, if I stepped in without thinking, they'd rewrite the story. Who is they, Mr. O'Neal? He looked her squarely in the eyes. The system that always sees us as guilty before human, that takes our kids' fear and calls it attitude. The murmurs in the gallery were immediate, soft, emotional, restrained only by the bailiff's presence. Amara nodded, calm. Mr. O'Neal, could you share with the court why this case specifically moved you to take legal action and become involved publicly? Shaq leaned forward slightly, his massive hands folded before him. I've been followed in stores wearing a Rolex and an NBA championship ring. I've been stopped for driving too slow in a neighborhood I owned a house in. I've been asked if the car I was sitting in was really mine, even after showing my license. He paused, swallowed. But none of that compared to watching an 8-year-old girl freeze like her life depended on standing still. Like she knew that moving too fast, or saying the wrong thing, might make her a threat. That's the kind of fear we pass down when the law forgets who it's supposed to protect. There wasn't a sound in the room. Not from the judge, not from the jury, not even from the press row, where pens had stopped scratching paper. Shaq looked toward the gallery, not breaking as he continued. I've worn a badge too. I was a reserve officer for years. I know the job's not easy, but the job doesn't excuse fear as a weapon. That badge is a promise, not a pass. He glanced briefly at Zariah, seated beside Kenya, her eyes wide but focused. He spoke the next words directly into the moment between them. She didn't do anything wrong, but the officer did, and the city erased the proof. That makes them responsible. Amara gently stepped back. No further questions. The city's attorney rose next, Ralph Edison, an aging man with thick glasses and a reputation for downplaying emotional appeals. He cleared his throat before beginning. Mr. O'Neal, with all due respect, you are an internationally known figure. Would you agree that your involvement in this case significantly amplified public opinion? Shaq didn't blink. Yes. And would you also agree that your public statements could be considered inflammatory? No, Shaq replied simply. They were accurate. Edison walked a slow circle. Is it possible, Mr. O'Neal, that your fame has influenced how this story is being perceived, rather than the facts alone? Shaq leaned forward, eyes calm, voice sharper now. My fame didn't yell at that little girl in the street. My fame didn't erase footage. My fame didn't file a false report. The facts influenced the story. I just made sure no one looked away. Edison tried again. But isn't it true you have a history of activism that's built on trying to make sure what happened to me doesn't keep happening to kids who look like me? Shaq interrupted, voice clear and anchored. You don't get to frame that as a flaw. Judge Mallory gave Edison a subtle warning glance. The attorney nodded, stepped back. No further questions. As Shaq left the stand, the atmosphere shifted. Something had cracked, not in anger, but in awareness. The room had changed. The air felt heavier, truer, like the space itself could no longer deny what it had absorbed. But the biggest surprise of the day came next. The bailiff called a new name, Officer Jonas Langston. Gasps moved through the crowd like wind in dry leaves. The city hadn't expected it this soon. But here he was, the young officer who had first come to Shaq in the shadows, now walking to the stand in full uniform, hands steady, eyes locked forward. Langston took the oath, sat tall, and began. I reviewed the raw footage of Officer Griggs' body cam, before it was removed from our system. What I saw did not match the incident report. Gasps again. The city attorney looked visibly rattled. Langston continued. Zariah Monroe crossed legally. Officer Griggs escalated without provocation. The footage was intact. Then it was gone. And who removed it? Amara asked. I can't confirm who executed the deletion, but the system logs showed internal tampering, time-stamped edits, administrative override. And you brought this forward because… Langston looked straight at the jury. Because silence is complicity, and that child deserves better than my fear. It was, simply, the moment everything turned. The court recessed soon after, but the streets didn't. Social media lit up with clips of Shaq's testimony. Quotes flooded timelines. News outlets plastered headlines like, O'Neal speaks, justice beyond the jersey, from NBA legend to civil rights witness. At home that night, Zariah sat with Kenya, watching the news. Her face wasn't scared anymore. It was steady. "Mama," she said. They listened. Kenya nodded, blinking tears. "They did, baby." Outside, the city hummed, but this time not in chaos, in awakening. Because some battles are won not by fists, or flames, or fury. Some are won by simply standing tall. And one day, she walked again, not alone. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles just before the world remembers it's alive. Sunlight spilled over the rooftops of East Broad Avenue, painting the sidewalks in gold. Trees swayed lightly, rustling above houses where radios murmured the day's headlines. But on this particular block, something unusual stirred. Calm, deliberate, and quietly powerful. Zaria Monroe stood at the corner of the same crosswalk where months earlier, the ground beneath her had felt like it might swallow her whole. But today her feet were still, her head high. In one hand her backpack, covered in stickers, faded from time. In the other, nothing. No popsicle. No fear. She glanced to her left, then right. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood Mr. Carter, a retired postal worker with a mustache as sharp as his memory. On her right, Nico Baptiste, a high school shop teacher who used to work security on the weekends. Behind her, two more fathers from the neighborhood, both wearing navy blue vests with the words Community Guardians stitched across the back in white thread. This wasn't a protest. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a new ritual born from pain and stitched together with pride. Every morning, a different team of fathers, or uncles, or coaches, or mentors walked students from this block to school. It began with Zaria, but it didn't end there. Today, it was Zaria's turn to lead, and she didn't hesitate. The crosswalk stretched before her like a challenge she'd already conquered. With a simple nod from Mr. Carter, she stepped forward. Cars paused. Drivers waved. The wind picked up. She didn't speed up, didn't shrink. She walked the way every child should be able to, without apology. Across the street, parked just outside the gym where so much of the story had unfolded, Shaquille O'Neal sat in the driver's seat of his SUV, alone. No cameras, no entourage, just him. A coffee cup in the holder, a worn folder in the passenger seat, and his hand resting on the wheel like he was holding something fragile. He didn't smile right away. He watched. Watched her posture, her pace, her quiet strength. He didn't need to get out, didn't need to wave. His presence had already been felt, built into the bones of the very moment unfolding in front of him. When Zaria reached the other side, she glanced toward the SUV, and even from the distance their eyes met. She gave a small knowing nod, the kind of nod that says, "I'm good now." Shaq nodded back. Nothing more. Back at the Monroe home, things had begun to resemble peace. Not perfection, but something that held. Kenya had returned to work part-time, splitting her days between advocacy meetings and volunteer work at Zaria's school. Her voice, once hoarse from holding in too much, had found new rhythm speaking at town halls, mentoring other mothers, helping them navigate systems that once swallowed her whole. Zaria had gone back to drawing more than ever. Her latest piece hung in the city library, a mural titled "The Line Between Us." In it, children of every shade walked across a street, their shadows tall and interwoven, forming the shape of an umbrella overhead. She never explained what it meant. She didn't have to. At school, things hadn't changed overnight. Some teachers still carried silent judgments. Some students repeated the noise they heard at home. But Zaria didn't shrink anymore. She spoke up. She raised her hand. She joined student council. And every now and then, when someone tried to quiet her, she'd reply with the same phrase she once whispered on the living room rug. "I'm still here." Shaq remained in her life, not as a headline, but as a constant. They didn't meet every week, didn't talk every day, but when they did, it was real. Quiet lunches, phone calls where Zaria told him about her science project, or asked why politicians sounded like they were always avoiding something. He'd laugh, then do his best to answer without losing the truth. One afternoon, she asked him, "Do you think they're still watching?" He knew what she meant. "Yeah," he said, "but now they know we're watching back." In the months following the verdict, city policies began to shift. A review board was formed, comprised of educators, parents, and youth advocates. Body cam protocols were rewritten. The school board implemented bias training, not as a box to check, but as a lived process monitored by the very communities they served. Officer Langston, now reinstated and promoted, helped develop a training curriculum titled Witness with Honor for incoming recruits. His module included a short video clip, Zaria's walk across the street, framed not as a moment of defiance but one of courage. When asked why he stayed in the department, Langston always gave the same answer: because change from inside matters too. As for Shaq, his public involvement lessened, But his impact didn't. He quietly funded 3 after-school programs in Zariah's name, focused on arts, civic education, and mental health. He gave no press release, just a simple plaque that read, "Built for those who speak even when the world tries not to hear." Years would pass, and the world would shift again. New injustices, new voices rising, new fights waiting in the wings. But something had changed in this corner of Atlanta. A precedent had been set. Not in the court, but in the community. Because the girl who once stood frozen in the crosswalk now walked it daily. And she never walked it alone. Winning doesn't always feel like victory. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, not with shouting or chants, but with breathless stillness. The kind of stillness that lives in the seconds before everything changes. Reporters sat like statues, court sketch artists scratched furiously, spectators clutched hands, notebooks hope, and at the center of it all, Zaria Monroe sat quietly between her mother and Amara, feet swinging above the polished floor, unaware of just how far her voice had traveled. The judge entered without flair, just the rustle of a robe, a gavel knock, and a glance toward the jury box. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Zaria Monroe." A pause, not long, but long enough for the words to land in every chest like a soft quake. "We determine that Officer Richard Griggs acted with willful misconduct, and that the Atlanta Police Department failed to uphold a duty of accountability. Damages awarded, $1.7 million, and the court recommends immediate departmental review under independent oversight." The room didn't explode. It didn't need to. A wave of exhaled relief swept through, like the air had been held hostage for weeks and was finally free. But no one clapped. There were no cheers. Because the weight of what it took to get here still lingered. Griggs wasn't in the courtroom. He'd been terminated days prior by internal ruling, quietly, without press, escorted out the back of the precinct like a man slipping out of a dinner party he'd crashed. The department issued a single statement. "We respect the court's decision and are committed to examining our procedures." No name, no admission, no apology. Zaria didn't ask for one. As the judge exited, Amara turned to Kenya, her expression unreadable. There was no celebration in her eyes, only affirmation. They'd moved a mountain. But the mountain had moved slowly, reluctantly, and left scars behind. Shaq had been seated in the second row, not center stage, not towering for effect, just present, steady, listening. When the verdict was read, he looked not at the press, not at the attorneys, but at Zaria. And for the first time in weeks, she looked back without the weight behind her eyes. Not gone, but lighter. That evening, the Monroe home was quiet. No camera crews, no reporters, just the rustle of a curtain in the breeze, and the smell of something warm on the stove. Kenya moved like she was relearning stillness. Zaria lay on the living room rug with crayons and paper, drawing again. Not from fear, not from pain, just drawing. Shaq knocked, then let himself in. He carried no speech, no flowers, just a small square box tucked under his arm, and that familiar calm that said, "I'm here." Kenya smiled faintly, nodded toward the rug. "She's been at it since we got back." Shaq crouched beside her, knees popping like old doors. "What you working on?" he asked. Zaria looked up, eyes clear, and turned the paper. It was a picture of a girl holding a sign that said, "I'm still here." Shaq blinked. Once.
"That's a strong message," he said.
She nodded. "I wanted to make sure they didn't forget." Shaq reached into the box and pulled out a framed photograph, one he'd taken quietly during one of their afternoons at the gym. In it, Zaria stood beside a row of other kids, all holding basketballs. But she was the only one looking directly at the lens. Unafraid, unflinching. He handed it to her. "You're not just still here," he said. "You changed everything." She smiled, not like a child being praised, but like someone finally believing it. Shaq looked over at Kenya. The exhaustion hadn't lifted, but it had settled, hardened into resolve. "You think they'll fix it?" she asked, not looking up. Shaq thought for a long moment. "I think they'll try to wait us out," he said honestly. "Hope we quiet down, get tired, move on." Kenya scoffed. "Then they don't know us." "No," Shaq agreed, "they don't." He stood, stretched his legs, and moved toward the window, watching dusk wrap the neighborhood in gold. The trees were still, the streets calm, but under it all he knew the story had reached farther than any of them could see. He turned back to Zaria. "You know," he said, "justice isn't clean. Sometimes it shows up late, sometimes it doesn't say sorry, but it's still worth fighting for." Zaria put down her crayon, looked up at him. "I know," she said softly. "I didn't need sorry. I just needed someone to stand up." Shaq smiled, and for the first time in weeks his eyes betrayed him. Just for a second. A flicker of wetness, caught and blinked away. Because that's what it was all about. Not headlines, not courts, not payouts.